Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. Today we're joined by Shelby and Madison, who are the co-founders of DoubleBlind, a digital media company at the forefront of the rapidly growing psychedelic movement. They are both journalists by trade, but have been working on creating more innovative models for building and scaling digital media organizations. Their writing spans the likes of Vice, Quartz, Rolling Stone, and the Huffington Post, and they are both longtime contributors to the psychedelic community. They advocate for the plant medicine movement, promote sacred reciprocity as a fundamental aspect of business in the space, and through their organization have created bridges between activists, researchers, healers, and entrepreneurs. Thank you, Shelby and Madison, for joining us, and welcome to Psyched.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so we've hosted you for Psych 2020. Our community knows you pretty well, but we would still love for you to just provide a few sentences on who you are, your backgrounds, and a little bit on DoubleBlind.
Want to start?
We met each other in journalism school. Shelby and I both, after journalism school, were writing and reporting on a lot of the same topics for the same publications. So cannabis and psychedelics, mainly for Vice, LA Weekly, Rolling Stone, etc. And we're also the co-founders of DoubleBlind, which is a magazine and digital media company covering psychedelics and all they intersect with, from social justice or social equity to environmental justice, mental health, policy, spirituality, queer culture, what have you. Shelby, do you want to explain how you got the idea for DoubleBlind?
Yeah, I was meditating in my apartment in New Orleans. I had this really amazing little studio on the edge of the French Quarter where horse and buggies would trot below my balcony and tubas would be like boom, 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 like under my balcony. And I was meditating, just trying to give you the full picture. And I got the idea, and I got up off my meditation pillow and I called Madison and I was like, hey, I have this idea, want to do it with me? And shortly thereafter, we called my best friend, David Good, from college. We're actually in his apartment right now. He is an absolutely incredible graphic designer, and he brought the entire concept of DoubleBlind to life through creating a visual identity for us, our logo, our colors, all of that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Yeah, I think that what you both are doing in this space is pretty unique, and not just in the space, but in digital media in general. Some of the conversations that we've had have been about building sustainable infrastructure, financial infrastructure for digital media organizations at a time when so many publications are going out of business, local news is really suffering. I'd love for you both to just enlighten us a little bit more about what are the considerations that digital media companies have to think about when they're trying to create financial stability for themselves.
Oh, I mean, it's a really big question. As Madison said, we've both spent our entire careers as journalists. I've done a lot of different things. I started out doing kind of the breaking news thing at CBS News, and I've also worked at intimate media startups. I was an editor at Pasadena Magazine, which is a local magazine in Pasadena. I worked at the main legacy newspaper in New Orleans. I don't say this because I care to tell you my resume. I say this because I want to just say that I have seen the inside of many, many different kinds of newsrooms who are creating many different kinds of content and are trying to monetize that content. And I've also personally experienced sort of the aftermath of what has happened as print has declined and people's attention spans have declined and social media has grown. And it's just, I mean, the volatility of the journalism industry is actually very, very devastating. There's a few sort of business models, common business models that newsrooms use, which I think people are familiar with. One of them is the paywall, right? Like the New York Times or the Wall Street journal, you read 3 articles and something pops up at you and says, now you have to pay if you want to keep reading more articles. And then secondarily, sort of like the click-driven digital ad model in which, you know, it's basically, it's advertising, and the advertising is determined by the number of people who click on the website. Neither model has worked very well. And newsrooms across the country, from the New York Times to the LA Times, have had to fire huge swaths of their newsroom. And so we always knew from the very beginning, when starting DoubleBlind, that we were going to need to think outside of the box in terms of a business model, not only one that was going to sustain the magazine, but one that felt really value aligned for us as people who care deeply about the psychedelic movement and about storytelling, and didn't want to threaten the integrity of what we were doing because we were relying on brands to give us money.
Definitely. And, you know, a lot of the things that you're doing currently are things that you've innovated on and come up with yourself. I would love to hear a little bit about when you see innovations coming at you or being offered to you, how do you as an organization decide, you know, what you're going to pursue and not? For instance, you know, everyone's getting onto TikTok nowadays, as silly as it might be in certain ways. Like, how do you as an organization make a decision of, okay, well, we should pursue TikTok as an avenue, or we're going to stay away from it for now because it doesn't necessarily align with our goals?
I think a lot of the decisions that we're making are based on what our audience responds to. So for instance, we have a course on how to grow mushrooms, and we were noticing even before we started that course that our audience responded really, really well to all of our psilocybin content and mushroom content. And, you know, sort of in the spirit of what we've seen with the cannabis movement and now the psilocybin mushroom movement, you know, grow your own, you know, we wanted to really enable and empower people to do that. And so the concept of a video course kind of, you know, as we've been putting it, sort of the master class of psychedelics, we also now have a Psychedelics 101 course, which teaches people how to trip with intention, essentially. You know, both those courses really take people through a very digestible set of videos accompanied by written content and live support with mycologists or integration therapists or what have you. And so we're kind of utilizing a lot of the, you know, what's already out there in the psychedelic space, right? So, you know, especially with COVID, everything is going online right now. There's all sorts of webinars that are teaching people how to do things, or, you know, virtual integration circles, or, you know, stuff like that. And so basically we're, you know, what we're doing really just fits into the model of what's becoming really popular. And again, is responding to a lot of what our audience seems to want and respond to based on, you know, the metrics of social media and what they're liking and interacting with and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that that's, you know, a really brilliant way to run a startup, is this iterative way and really follow what your audience is looking for. I think what a lot of people are looking for outside of education right now is also kind of consumer packaged goods, CPG, ways to be able to take microdoses, but in a beautifully designed package, things like that. Being, you know, creators of educational content, where do you see the bridge between packaged goods and kind of these types of products that people will have in hand and be able to consume without necessarily being educated on how to use them, and then education, which might not necessarily come with the product, but allows for individuals to actually learn and gain deeper insight? Like, what's the bridge between those two worlds, and how can we allow for both of them to reaffirm one another and create just more positivity in the ways that people engage with psychedelics?
I mean, there aren't a lot of quote unquote consumer packaged goods right now available to support people on their journeys with psychedelics. DoubleBlind has a Shopify store. We partner with DanceSafe to sell MDMA and LSD testing kits. There's a microdosing kit for 1T LSD that's out of Canada that we did a story on, but like we've never tried to use it before, and it's not available in the US. So there really isn't much at this point. That being said, we do anticipate that that will change a lot in the next 5 years. We think DoubleBlind is really well positioned to sell some of those things. And for us, I mean, I think that we can really look to the cannabis industry as a model. At the time that the cannabis industry began to sell a lot of products in sort of like the post Proposition 64 world, products that people weren't familiar with, whether it was like a CBD transdermal patch or like whatever other crazy things are out now, cannabis Listerine strips, all kinds of stuff. You know, people weren't familiar with how to use these things. And so a lot of cannabis companies were I don't want to say forced, because a lot of them genuinely care about responsible use, but they really had to take on this educational component as well, which is why you see so many cannabis brands like Weed Maps or like Ease that actually have really robust blogs that are publishing stories as well.
Mm-hmm. One thing about cannabis that I think a lot of people pay attention to is in the creation of the markets and the creation of products and services, all focused around cannabis. There were entire swaths of demographics of individuals that were left out of that boom. I was wondering if you both could speak to kind of, do you see that similarly happening in psychedelics? Do you see organizations doing anything to be able to counteract that? What are ways that we can be more inclusive as a psychedelic ecosystem, more so than the cannabis ecosystem was?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a really big concern and a really active topic of conversation right now. Specifically with cannabis, part of it is that, for instance, when California legalized both adult use and medical marijuana, that was in its own sort of separate realm, right? So cannabis isn't like something you can buy at your health food store along with, vitamins and so forth. And so like having this whole separate paradigm for how to deal with cannabis really made it difficult for a lot of people to participate in the legal market because of all the regulations and the capital needed in order to comply with those regulations, to sort of be a competitive player in that sphere. And so a lot of people who are not already well capitalized basically have just been pushed out of the regulated market and are currently functioning in the quote unquote traditional market, including people who really helped to legitimize cannabis for the decades prior to when legalization even happened. And so there's a lot of concern right now within the psychedelic space that much of the same thing is going to be happening with psilocybin or other psychedelics as well. There are also questions of access in regard to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So right now, MDMA and psilocybin in a synthetic form are being fast-tracked by the FDA to become prescription medications in conjunction with therapy for PTSD and depression. And again, there's questions of, well, will insurance cover this? How accessible will it be? If you can't get a diagnosis, can you get the therapy, et cetera? And so we're actually seeing in Oregon right now, Psy 2020, which is an initiative to legalize psilocybin therapy. So basically psilocybin only in therapeutic context, you'd have to be working with a facilitator, but it's kind of an alternative to the FDA model. So we're going to see sort of how that happens and how that plays out and how people will be able to afford that and how accessible it will be. But by and large, I think, what we've seen through decriminalized nature, which I know there's all these things that I'm referring to, so I'm trying to explain it as I go. What we're seeing specifically with decriminalized nature measures, which is decrim nature, is what decriminalized all naturally occurring psychedelics in Oakland, Santa Cruz, and looking to do so in other jurisdictions as well. And in Denver, which decriminalized just psilocybin, there's a grow, gather, gift model. So basically trying to get around having to have a retail model with dispensaries and really just allowing people to grow their own medicine, give it away to people, have enough for personal possession amounts. That is all well and good, but a lot of people really are concerned about the providers of the medicine and making sure that they're also protected by the law, which currently they're not. So, in terms of access and, equity within the industry, I mean, I do think there are legitimate fears that eventually there are just going to be major pharmaceutical style players who come in and sort of dominate the industry in a lot of ways. And as far as things in place to make sure that stuff like that doesn't happen, or if to make sure that as that happens, there are also alternatives, that's an ongoing conversation. And I mean, Shelby, are you seeing anything specifically that is aiming to counter those efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there are some for-profit entities that have tried to patent particular applications of psychedelics that have been in the public domain for decades. So we've seen some for-profit entities, for example, it's called a use patent. So essentially psilocybin and LSD are both in the public domain. They can't be patented, but you can potentially have a for-profit entity come in and say, well, we're not patenting LSD, but we're patenting the use of LSD for opioid use disorder. I'm just making that up. And we have also seen kind of on the sidelines, some people who are really devoted to equity and access quietly challenging those patents. So that's something that's been going on. And then I also do think that the decriminalized nature model is kind of the most like large scale attempt to provide an alternative to the FDA approved model. And then of course, you know, I think that the movement to diversify the therapists and participants within psychedelic trials is an aim to try and make the psychedelic space more equitable. Monica Williams, who's sort of a leader in this regard, she's a therapist of color who's leading MAPS MDMA trials for assisted psychotherapy specifically for people of color, did a study which found that I think it's like more than 80% of participants in MAPS trials going back to 1993 were white. And so now there's a real effort to change that and to recruit people of color, both professionally and in these trials.
I'd also add in the ketamine world, SAGE, which is a ketamine clinic in Oakland, has also been a leader specifically in providing access to the medicine for people who are not coming from as privileged backgrounds, and specifically also catering to people who maybe have you know, race-based trauma in ways that other clinics or pharmaceutical companies have yet to really display.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The last piece as well is retreat centers. I mean, there's just so much to say about this, Marique. So, I mean, this is the whole conversation in and of itself. But there are, you know, I did a piece for DoubleBlind last year called The Ayahuasca Privilege. And it was really looking at why the heck are psychedelic retreats so freaking expensive. And I was really frustrated actually, because I personally wanted to sit in an ayahuasca ceremony. I wanted to do a one-to-one ceremony because I wanted to go really deep with my facilitator. And she quoted me like, I can't even remember how many thousands of dollars for one night. And I was just like, what the heck? Like, who can afford this? And so it prompted me to do this story. And as I actually started interviewing tons and tons of people who run retreat centers and underground shamans and practitioners, I realized, oh, it's actually really expensive to run a retreat center. Like you're running basically like a hotel, like in the jungle, like you need hundreds of like dozens of people on staff, you need trained facilitators, sometimes in certain cases, like you need medical staff there. And so it's not that easy to just like, you know, retreat centers aren't raking it in, so to speak, but there has been a lot of talk like among retreat centers to try and subsidize some of the retreats like Synthesis, and there's a nonprofit called Heroic Hearts, which is providing grants to veterans who want to drink ayahuasca for their trauma. So there's some movement in that regard as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting organizations doing great work to provide access. One of them you mentioned, Madison, is SAGE, who has a sliding scale model to provide greater access. I'd love to hear thoughts on, you know, so many individuals specifically working within the ecosystem today, talking more about business, are also fans of promoting psychedelics as kind of a new leaf in every sense, not just a new leaf for therapy, but also a new leaf for our economic systems, our political systems. How far do you think that the psychedelic movement will actually push some of the current infrastructure we have in place to govern societies today? Is a lot of this just, you know, speculation and excitement, or do you really think that, you know, this next wave over the next 10 to 20 years is going to have significant ramifications in regards to the types of economic systems, the types of social systems that we actually continue to empower as a society?
Yeah, it's a great question. I did a story a couple years ago on the role of PTSD in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I'm using this as an example because I think that trauma is really kind of at the core of the way a lot of people function politically. And, you know, if you define trauma as like the feeling of being unsafe, and then look at the way people respond to perceived threats in society, whether it's, you know, the other side of a conflict or the threat of being poor and not being able to afford to live or to eat, and voting for leaders that are kind of manipulating into the, manipulating and utilizing these fears that people have, I think that's going to perpetuate a lot of the issues that we're currently facing. So I think first and foremost, when we talk about psychedelic healing, there's a relationship between healing the individual and healing the collective. And that's kind of related. So when you deal with your individual stuff and you're maybe like, you deal with this trauma or existential fears or, loneliness epidemic or depression or whatever, then you're just able to sort of interact with the world in a different way. And by the same token, one of the tenets of psychedelics, if you have a quote unquote mystical experience, which scientists have defined by a number of criteria, including one, which is oneness. You're feeling more camaraderie with people around you, with the world at large, with the environment. You have more environmental awareness. And so ideally, if you have a feeling of connection toward other people and toward the environment, the political decisions you make are going to reflect that. Do you want to add anything, Shelby?
That was beautifully said. I mean, so to me, like that scenario that Madison painted is possible, would be possible if psychedelics were administered on a large scale. So then the question is, like, is that ever going to happen? Or if it's not going to happen, like, what is the tipping point? How many people need to have transformative experiences, need to work through their trauma, need to find healing in order for us to see sort of like a cumulative impact on the way that society operates at large? And that's like to be seen. And I'm not qualified to make that hypothesis, but I'm sure someone much smarter than I who knows how to use Excel really well could.
Yeah, Excel, the savior of souls. Yeah, so in regards to kind of the healing of the individual versus the collective or the community, let's say that we have, these trillions of dollars that will eventually go into mental health over the coming decades. If you had the ability to kind of take those financial resources and split them between helping individuals heal and helping communities grow in their collaborative efforts, how would you make that split? Does one have to come before the other? Do they happen in parallel? What seems to be more important at this point in time for us going forward?
You're saying like funding communal healing versus funding individual healing?
Yeah.
I mean, I think they're part and parcel to the same thing, right? I mean, if you have money to enable access, to maybe, maybe there's like a scholarship fund for psychedelic healing, right? Like having people be able to sponsor lower income people in order to get psychedelic therapy who otherwise wouldn't be able to get it. That's addressing community issues at large while also enabling people within those communities to actually have a shot at feeling more well or feeling better. So, I've had a friend actually, she talks a lot about Black Lives Matter movement. And she says, if you really care about Black lives, then you'll care also about the issues that are affecting Black lives and are keeping communities down, one of which is the drug war, right? So being, really understanding how policies that affect a community at large also affect the individuals within that community. So when you have people who are ending up, in single parent households because somebody got busted for weed and is now doing all this time in prison, and having where, and also that people are systemically targeted by law enforcement, there's a relationship between the systemic and the individual, and there's not there's not a lot of separation, especially if you define privilege as sort of not being so affected by these systemic issues, right? So to not care about politics as large is to sort of like be above the way politics will actually influence your specific life.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I don't know if that answers the question, but
no, I think so, and I think there's been a lot of conversations, and I think that this is what brings at least myself and many of the individuals that I feel like myself and you both resonate with in this field, is that the conversations that you're having on a day-to-day basis aren't just about the bottom line, because they can't be. They're about so much more, and about how transformational all of this can be, whether it is or is not, we'll see. But it might have that potential. And in the course of building everything, we have the ability to be more aware. And it's interesting to be more aware of how all these things are interconnected. I'd love to hear, are there any entrepreneurs, journalists, healers, anyone that you feel like in the space is not necessarily getting, or organizations, anyone in the space who's not necessarily getting the attention that they deserve, that should really be given more of a platform, that's doing really meaningful work?
I mean, there's a lot of people who are doing incredible work. I think that Bia Labache at Shakruna is doing amazing work in terms of diversifying the voices at the forefront of the movement. She's really been a pioneer. She did a conference called Queering Psychedelics last year, which was the first conference ever specifically highlighting queer issues within the psychedelic space. She's also does panels, has done panels specifically highlighting women, indigenous voices, people of color. I think Mike Margolin at Psychedelic Seminars is doing some incredible work as well in terms of diversifying voices. And who else? We love the Temple of the Way of Light in Iquitos, Peru. They have an incredible nonprofit attached to their retreat center called the Shaikuni Institute, which is focused around, providing opportunity to local indigenous people, as well as the sustainability of the ayahuasca vine. ICEERS is a nonprofit based out of Barcelona, which also does really important work, bringing indigenous voices, highlighting indigenous voices in the psychedelic space. They have, every other year, they have a conference called the World Ayahuasca Conference. I went last year in Girona, Spain. It was amazing. There were more than 500 shamans there, more than 30 indigenous communities from the Amazon, all of which ICEERS raised money to fly indigenous leaders from the Amazon to Spain to participate. They had a whole room at the conference, which was called I forget what they called it, but essentially they did they realized after speaking to indigenous leaders who had been to conferences in the past that indigenous people don't always like to dialogue in the way that Western academic people like to dialogue, i.e. on a stage in front of a PowerPoint or sitting at a booth talking to a bunch of other people on a stage in front of an audience. And so they created this basically just this room that was specifically designated for the indigenous people who were there, where they could just play music together and hold ceremony and essentially commune and dialogue in a way that felt good to them, which I thought was really interesting and progressive and important. I don't know, there's so many people doing important work within the space. And I think that a lot of times at conferences, we do see the same voices appearing over and over again. And I often say there's a lot of great, wonderful, white educated men with PhDs in the psychedelic space, but there's other people too. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit more about folks who are values aligned and what you look for. You both have had the experience of raising capital from investors, and investors are a very different crowd than healers from the Amazon. What does it look like to identify someone who's values aligned? What are signs that you might look for when you're interacting with someone who's investing capital in this space?
We said no to almost everybody. And for us, we always jokingly said that before we started publishing the psychedelic equivalent of cat videos on DoubleBlind, that we would not be in business. So for us, we're really here to create content that we believe in, and otherwise, I don't know what else to say about that. I think that in terms of connecting with the right investors, investors are people, and as in all relationships, it just takes time. You're not going to know someone in one conversation. Also, of course, just in general with meeting people and building relationships, it's always great to meet people who come through other people that you know really well and that you trust. So we've had a lot of people just reach out to us on LinkedIn and want to talk to us about investing. And, we're open to having conversations with people who just hit us up, but obviously it's going to take a little while. before we feel comfortable engaging in a formal partnership with someone if like they're just coming from nowhere and we have no context for like who they are or what their values are. And then I think that you can also just look at like what is someone's track record, like what other kinds of companies have they invested in before, what other kinds of like things are they doing? Like we really love to see people who are also investing a lot of money in the nonprofit side of the psychedelic space, whether it be like MAPS or Shakruna or elsewhere, because to me that indicates that like they don't care, like, so they're not just in this to see a return on their investment, they're in this because they want to put their money towards like the right people and the right ventures and the right initiatives. And then also like lastly, and this may seem silly, like I always lead with like, what is your personal relationship with psychedelics? Because Madison and I feel really passionately that anyone who is in this space needs to be doing the work themselves and needs to have like an intimate relationship like with entheogenic states of mind so that they can relate to like what it is that we're all even talking about here. Like if you're just coming from the cannabis industry or big pharma and like you've never tripped before and you don't want to trip, like that is a red flag to me.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I think we're running out of time, but I would love to give you the floor to, just if you have any sort of message you want to impart to our audience, anything else that you want to share, would love to hear.
Words of wisdom?
Oh, words of wisdom. I don't know. I mean, I think one thing that is like kind of just to echo what Shelby said is like to put the entheogens first, right? And like really try to see what the lessons are from the psychedelics and cannabis and whatever, and then like uphold the spirit of those medicines and integrate that into the way that we do journalism, or we put together a pharmaceutical company or put together a nonprofit or what have you, and it's really just putting again the values that you come to under the influence of psychedelics into action in our regular daily lives. And of course, just to plug DoubleBlind, you can find us doubleblindmag.com and follow us on social media at doubleblindmag.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for coming on, and to our listeners, we'll see you next time on Psyched.
Thank you.
Thank you.